everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second half of the second day of the first New Mexico Foundation for Open Government City of Albuquerque Hackathon celebrating public arts data. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about FOG before we actually get going, but this is a workshop that is not only with talking a little bit about FOG, but one of my board members in Santa Fe, Tom Johnson, who works with the People's Data, is joining us, and then the City of Albuquerque's Deputy Director of IT,
Mark Leach.
Thank you. Mark Leach is going to be joining us as well. We're going to hold our questions and answers for later, but I did want to go through a few things with you just to get started. FOG is actually a 30-year-old organization. We began in 1978. Why won't this work? This is not changing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So this is just the Zoom instance here. So yeah, got it.
We were founded in 1989 by several folks, including AP veteran reporter Bob Johnson. Bob Johnson came to Albuquerque as the head of the AP Bureau, decided he was going to retire at some point, and looked around and realized that this organization was needed extremely, and it's been extremely helpful. We are a nonpartisan, we are a nonprofit. We have a 501(c)(3) status. If you would like to donate to FOG at any time, you can go to nmfog.org, and there's some really easy ways you can donate monthly, yearly, etc. We have a board of directors, and they come from the areas of law, the media, journalism, business, and members of the general public. We do have grants and special events that support our operations. We do have a team of pro bono attorneys who actually do a lot of our legal work for us. Oh, what happened? Access to public records is guaranteed by the federal government and by the state of New Mexico. There's no reason you should not have access to public records. They belong to you. You bought them, you paid for them, and they're your records. The state, the city, the county, the school board may hold those records in trust for you, but they are your record. That's something you need to keep in mind because that is really important. What are some of the things that FOG does? Well, we have a 3-tier mission. Our first tier is to advocate on behalf of the Open Meetings Act and the Inspection of Public Records Act. Our second key is that we advocate for folks who need help in getting public records. The second part of our mission is to educate individuals about their rights concerning the Open Meetings Act, the Inspection of Public Records Act, and the third part of our mission is to litigate in those cases when we have to. FOG has been in operation for 30 years. We've lost one lawsuit in those 30 years that we've been involved in protecting the people's data. What is the Freedom of Information Act? Well, the Freedom of Information Act is actually a federal law. It involves the records that are held by the federal government and its many agencies. In New Mexico, we have what we call IPRA. It's a nickname. IPRA is the acronym for the Inspection of Public Records Act. And records that are held by New Mexico public agencies are subject to inspection under this act. Believe it or not, there is a whole guidebook concerning this act. It's called the Inspection of Public Records Compliance Guide. It's put out by the State Attorney General, and you can get a free copy and download it and put it on your computer. Kudos to the Attorney General, because there's actually an app for that. You can now go and get an app that has the Inspection of Public Records Act Compliance Guide and put it on your phone. You just go into your app store just like you would download any app, and it's available to you. So you have at your fingertips and no reason not to comply. FOG defends your right to know. We do it in multiple ways. And the first way is we have a hotline. We answer about 500 calls a year from people throughout the state who have questions about the Inspection of Public Records Act or the Open Meetings Act. Our number is 505-764-3750. The second way that you can reach out to us is through email, info@nmfog.org. With that, that gives you a little bit of an overview of FOG. If you want more information, you can go to nmfog.org, our website, or you can call us on the hotline and we can help you. With that, I'm going to turn over to Tom, and Tom is now going to start. Now I need to get out of this.
All right, let's see, Tom, it looks like we are ready for you to go ahead and share. All right, Tom, I think we are good to go.
We're good to go. Okay. Thank you, Eric. I can't see the audience, so since I'm in the city of Santa Fe, I will take it as a matter of holy faith that there is a real audience out there. Thank you all for coming. I'm greatly honored to be part of this initial hackathon being put on by the city of Albuquerque and the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government. So you can see what I'm going to do is talk a little bit, 30 minutes or less, about open data, something that I believe is a cornerstone for the informed democratic citizenry. But first, I'd like to start with a little thought experiment. Imagine that you paid for in full a large screen television. Oh, it's a grand thing. We can't wait to watch the Super Bowl or the World Series one of these years. But you bought that set, yet you don't have that big screen in your media room. It's down at the dealer's store somewhere. The dealer has kept your new set somewhere in the back room. And he'll only let you watch your TV under certain conditions. Now, it's probably in the store, or so you believe. But to watch anything, you must submit a written request to come into the showroom, and only at a time convenient to the store and its employees, or you wait until the dealer summons you saying, your TV is turned on now. The dealer is turning it on, he's got it back there in the storeroom, and consequently, you might sometimes be able to hear the programming, but if you want to see, say, a news guy, you might have to buy a large mirror and prop it up in a doorway at the right angle to see the screen. But even so, you're not allowed to bring a camera in to record shows and the ads. That is essentially what's going on today with the people's data. Such is our situation where citizens have paid government at all levels to collect and maintain and administer truckloads of data, mountains of data, which, just like your TV in the warehouse, you know the data is there, but you can't see it or use it. Now, for centuries, taxpayers have paid government to collect data about health, education, contracts, traffic flow, police and fire applications and permits, budgets and expenditures. More recently, COVID testing, vaccination registration, and where we were or are in the queue for shots. Most of this data, which I estimate to be roughly 85%, has little to do with an individual's privacy or public security. Those governments generally, like our TV dealer, are keeping the people's data somewhere behind the counter, stored in dusty boxes with few labels describing the contents. The data could be used to drive informed decisions about voting for candidates or on bond issues or health care or economic growth or public safety or potential improvements to the quality of life. That data will drive all of those decisions only if we could have access to that data to analyze it. So what is or what are the people's data? Why should we care? And why can't we get it? Before addressing those questions, let me lay in a bit of background. The broader and more generic and indeed global term for what we're talking about is open data. That is data in all forms and formats that is available to everyone. That data is available without restrictions. That data is available in whatever format is used to create and administer the data, and it's available in baseline exportable formats, such as Excel or Word or a text file, or even graphic files such as PNG. Now, the concept of open data is a philosophy embedded in sharing and collaboration. It's a series of management policies and it's processes that emphasize the sharing and collection and distribution methods. The aim is to make open data initially what the technology people call public facing, instead of only asking the question, how is this data going to be used by our agency or our department? You start out by saying, how can we share this government data? The data, as I said, is available in native file formats. And the reason why we want it is that experience over the past 10 to 15 years has shown first that open data facilitates government efficiency. That is, there are many cases where the data in one administrative section, say the Department of Public Safety or the Department of Finance, is used by either or both of those agencies. And so if people in those different agencies or sectors get at the data, then there's going to be more efficiency there. There's going to be greater transparency, which I'll talk about in a minute, and there will be greater accountability, and we hope in the end, public participation. I also suggest that when we pay our dues to the government, there is an implied contract between taxpayers and the government. That is, items that a court will or should assume are intended to be included in that contract, even if they are not expressly stated. When we go visit a doctor, there is an implied contract that he or she will try to fix, repair, or improve whatever ails us. We don't have any sign any contract. They don't sign any contract. I suggest that when we pay our taxes, there is an implied contract with the governments that the governments will use that money we pay to collect, maintain, and administer data collected for the betterment of the community at large. And therefore, the community has the right and the responsibility to have access to that data and how it was administered, so that we can see the results of the efforts of our public administrators. At least I believe that, although I don't think that my view of implied contract regarding data has ever been directly tested in court, at least not yet. So with this perspective, if it truly is the people's data, the questions become, who benefits from having access to the people's data? Why do we want or need that data? How do we get it? And what needs to be done to make it useful? Also, what are the barriers to getting the people's data? These are major topics that we won't have time for this afternoon to address in great detail, but I bet that some of you participating in the hackathon have already run across some of these issues and given them some thought. I think that we can all agree that we pay taxes to governments at all levels, local, state, and national. And we also can agree that our governments collect and save data, starting with knowing whether or not we as individuals pay those taxes. It's hardly a novel concept. In Babylon, records were kept in cuneiform script on clay tablets. The Inca Empire kept records in a system of knots called quipu. In the Middle Ages and onward, kings and popes and mayors and priests tracked births and marriages and deaths. In the case of the United States, the government has been harvesting data since the colonial period. The call for data collecting shows up high in the Constitution, where it says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among several states according to their respective numbers, followed by a call for an actual enumeration, that is, a census. And we're seeing right now how the census data is being used to try to define new districts for elections. The census, a topic and a data set that's been debated literally since the beginning of our nation. And to this day, I think it can be argued that the census data may be the largest public data set in the nation, and if not the largest, probably the most used and the most useful. Our census data is used 24/7 by every government agency, every business or intended business, by thousands of residents tracking their family trees. Am I allowed to profess love for a data set? Yeah, it's pretty weird, but if so, make my Valentine for the Census Bureau data a public declaration. And these are good folks and they're important folks. And remember too, that the Census Bureau does more than just count heads. It also does regular enumerations or censuses of all kinds of transportation activities, business types, et cetera. A few weeks ago, I was able to look at, I was looking for something having to do with pets, and I could find the number of veterinarians and the number of companies that supply food just for the pet industry and the volume of that food. That kind of marketing information can be extremely helpful for any kinds of economic development. All right, so with that overly long prologue, what are we going to do today? What are we going to talk about today? I want to draw the distinction between what are some of the barriers of getting the people's data and how we can start to get around those barriers. First, let me emphasize that open data is not the same as transparency. Open data is not transparency, that favorite word of contemporary political candidates. Oh, we want to have a transparent government. There is a classic and a very important difference between transparency and open data. The difference is that when we have transparency, it's as though we're looking through a glass display case and seeing a wonderful piece of jewelry, say a grand Navajo pawn bracelet, versus open data, and where we actually have the clerk give it to you so you can hold it in your hand. You can touch it, you can heft it, you can try on that wonderful piece of craftsmanship to analyze its weight or to closely examine the mineral currents weaving through the polished turquoise. One version is transparency. The second is having the access to the data to do the appropriate analysis to see if you want to buy it. So they said, by definition, open data is a concept, it's a philosophy, it's a policy, and it's processes that I will argue is the bedrock for moving the El Dorado ideal of it's the people's data from theory to practice. Then we can get into the history a little bit about the history of open data, which is only about 12 years old. Now, the thing is that open data is being applied in many disciplines, professions, and institutions, not just government. You can see people arguing for open data of the law, for example, saying that every filing in the courts should be available to the people, as should be every ruling, and it should be there for free. Why? Because access to the data has significant to high quality value for many, even most processes and organizational activities, especially when it comes to analysis and decision making. So finally, I hope to get a little bit into why should citizens care about this. Now, both anecdotes and research illustrate that when government agencies make their data available, citizens appreciate it. I recall at an international meeting in Mexico City where there was an attendee from Sicily. Yeah, Sicily, not Southern Sudan. Anyway, this fellow reported that his countrymen and women were constantly complaining that their legislators never did anything. Like most legislators, the real work takes place in committees. Citizens couldn't appreciate that because they literally can't see those legislators as committee members at work. Ultimately, when a bill is passed by a committee and ready for a vote, it is presented on the floor of the House or the Senate for votes. Sometimes there will be debate, but not often. It's only then, at least in the past, when citizens could literally see their representatives at work. That did change a bit in our legislators' last session just completed. We could see some committees at work. In the case of the Sicilians, when video cameras were installed in the committee rooms and Sicilians could actually see what was going on, public attitude changed. Respect levels improved. I don't know if that's happened in New Mexico just yet, but these examples may suggest that open data is only for large and complex governments. Are they limited examples in government complexity? Well, what's going on in our specific cities? Both Albuquerque, I think, and certainly the city of Santa Fe could be doing a better job of broadcasting in easy to find ways of things, the committee meetings, as well as the city council meetings. Now, these beneficial factors are important, but they're often hard to measure and perhaps fleeting. Not so when we examine how open data is the feedstock for development and growth in every sector of a city, state, or national economy. Let's say you want to start a small business. How about a pet grooming business? You're going to first, I hope, do some research and get some data related to pets and pet stores. And hence, we're not only back to the national data and county level data in the census, but you also want to look up and see what kind of pet serving stores do we have in your particular city. What we find is that there are some fascinating examples of where open data has had direct economic value for a particular city. For example, as we indicate here, the city of Chicago put in its public health department, took the open data philosophy, and instead of requiring people to ask for the data, they simply took, when somebody asked for data, put it up there and left it up there online for the next person to come along. Therefore, that reduced the amount of time that in Chicago had to spend on giving and looking for and giving people data. The more they put out there, the greater number of Chicago, the equivalent of Chicago FOIA address fell. The city of San Francisco used open data for something as simple as real-time bus maps, moving bus locations, and literally calls go down to the helpline. We're fortunate in that under Mark Leach and the University of New Mexico, we've had good bus routing in Albuquerque for many years. In Santa Fe, we only achieved hooking buses to the Google route maps about a year and a half ago. I think after we got a new city clerk and we had a new mayor and we had people who understood how Google would do that. The transit department was way ahead of it, but could never get it through city council. Chicago is using GIS data to show the location of snow plows in the winter. And this helps people know, hey, when's the plow coming to my neighborhood so I can get rid of it, get my car moved. State of California opened up a state portal and allowed citizens to look at the vehicles that were being used throughout the state and doing citizens
Sherry, are you still in? Yep. Let's see. This is the problem with free Wi-Fi.
contracts from government
This
at all
meeting
levels.
is being
The
recorded.
problem with using vendors to collect data is that the vendors are not given to exporting or making the data that they are generating, collecting, managing, generating. They don't want to make that data available to us, the people who are paying for that work. And they say, oh, it's intellectual privacy, it's intellectual policy.
Tom, just sorry to interrupt. We lost you for just a couple minutes with a little bit of a Zoom Wi-Fi problem. I think if you could probably restart like at the beginning of this slide for the sum up, I think that should be good, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, sorry about that.
Okay, have we got me now?
Yep, you're good.
How's the audio? I'm not hearing Eric. How's the audio?
Yeah, you're good. I just have to get back on the stage to say hi. Yeah, you're good. Do you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So let's put a wrap on this. Let me emphasize again that transparency, which politicians and even public administrators talk about, is not the same as open data. Transparency, you can see the stuff. You can see a PDF file of a city's budget, but you have to go through some steps to get that data in the city's budget into a form that you can analyze. And when you have the data in an analytic format, like a spreadsheet format, then you can start questions of that data. You can take the city of Albuquerque's budget, and you can say, okay, here are all the departments in Albuquerque. Let's compare them to what's going on in Oklahoma City, and let's see if there are comparable municipal expenditures in these two cities. Let's look for trends of increase or decrease in each of the departments in the city so that we as informed citizens can go to our city council meetings and say, hey, how come you're reducing the budget in the public libraries by 23% and no other city in the Rockies is doing that? So keep in mind, go for open data. Don't buy the story about being about just transparency. Next, we need to be able to see the contracts that are going out to vendors. More and more cities are contracting out to have data management tasks being done instead of training people already in government to do a variety of things. There's a problem with that. Most vendors will put out data of some kind, but when you ask a vendor, okay, how did you collect and analyze that data? What were the algorithms that you used? They will say, no, that's intellectual property. We're not going to tell you that. I'm starting a battle right now with the water department in the city of Santa Fe because they say, well, you got to have levels of water usage. And I'm saying, well, how are you measuring my levels of water usage? What is my baseline? How do I know when I exceed that? The water department has vendored out the software to do that. And the only answer I've gotten so far from our local people is that, well, it's in the system. Well, that doesn't give me any information that I can use. And so when the vendors are refusing to show us how they generate the data they have, then we as taxpayers have lost some decision-making capabilities. Next, we need to change, I believe, the big challenge is to change the culture of government. Government employees should begin by asking, instead of, how will this data help my department? They need to start out with the premise of, how can I share this data? Yes, there will be conditions of privacy and ethics to be addressed. And government is really not doing that in a serious way, at least as I can tell in the state of New Mexico. But if we start out with the presumption of we're going to share all the data and then scale it back, then I think society, our democratic society, will be better off instead of asking, how little do I have to give out? One of the ways that we can do that is that in our state of New Mexico, we have what are called public records custodians. These are people in each department and all levels of government who are assigned the task of making the people's data available to the people. I suggest that we change that job title, and this would be a relatively easier maneuver, to public records provider, trying to get the people in those positions to see that their job is not to be data huggers, but rather to push the data out to all citizens at all levels who request it. Okay, I would be glad to take some questions if we want to do that now, Eric, or I'd be glad to pass the baton on to Albuquerque's own Mark Leach. I think that there are not many people in Albuquerque that know that their city was a very early adopter of the open data concept going back 6 or 8 years. Albuquerque as a city was a global leader in making the people's data available, and with it, the foundational aspect called metadata. Maybe Mark will talk about that a bit, but as Albuquerque has long time been a leader in this, and I give you the guy who started it all, Mark Leach.
Thank you very much, Tom. Always a pleasure working with you on these presentations, and I appreciate the way that you guys that you challenge us and really push us to keep us honest on this stuff.
Oh, you already, let's see. I'm going to take you off
Cool.
the spotlighted guy.
Boom. That's all right, Tom. You can hit the glass of vodka now.
That's my job.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about open data, and what I've deliberately done is I've kept it fairly unscripted. I've not known what's going to come up from some of the discussions over the past couple of days, and I wanted to make sure that we're kind of like relevant in what we're talking about here. I also wanted to kind of like dovetail into some of the discussions that Tom really did a good job in opening up on, and kind of like maybe give a little bit more of a technology give a bit more of a technology kind of like insight as to why some of these things are important. And I want to kind of like really push home on the difference between transparency and open data, and I'll start with that first, because there is a difference. For us, we can be transparent. We can tell our story. We can use our data to tell our story. But until we make that data available to you in kind of like a machine-readable format, we're not really helping. Yeah. So we're actually a leader in the way we do governmental transparency. Back in 2008, we were working with Sunlight Foundation. During that period of time, we had something like AAA ratings for our transparency websites. So when it comes to transparency, we certainly understand what we're doing. We've got a great team over at the City Clerk's office with Miriam and also with Ethan. And again, we're very lucky to have those people there. They really get transparency. They really get the importance of being accountable to government. And so kind of like certainly in the Southwest, it's something I've been very grateful for as both somebody who's come from a little further than just kind of like Santa Fe. It's good to have that kind of governmental accountability. But I want to really dive into what is open data, because open data, I think, has a little bit of a kind of like a misnomer. Open data is when I provide you the data in machine-readable format. That's the key part here. It's the machine readability. It's no good me just giving you a kind of like a PDF, as Tom's pointed out, or a website. That's great. That's being transparent. I can show you what I'm doing. I can be honest about what I'm doing. Great example being the fact that the city does have all agendas and minutes online. You can go and see GOV-TV. You can go and look at agendas and meetings. That's available today. That's being transparent. But when I talk about open data, I'm talking about making files available for you to download. Or rather, not for you to download, but for your computer to download and your computer to interact on. So those CSV files, for example, we've been talking about over the past couple of days, that's open data. It is a key to being transparent. It's a foundational piece, but it's not in of itself transparency. Transparency is when I'm telling you what I do, and I'm being clear about and honest about what I do. Okay? Open data, if you like, is kind of like the means to do that in a standardized way. And a great example is you think about driving a car, right? Say for me, like me, you come into America and you kind of like first thing you do is you hit Hertz. And I was actually talking to my daughter who knew a guy who this happened to him. And the first thing he did when he was in America was he didn't go rushing off to see the Statue of Liberty or anything like that. He went to try and rent a car. Now, he was from Europe. He was from Holland, actually. And if you think about it, it would be awful if the car he wanted to drive didn't work properly or was laid out slightly differently. Yeah? Certainly in England, I've had to learn that kind of like you sit on a different side of the car. Yeah? The steering wheels are in weird places. It's something I have to work with. It's something I have to deal with. This guy from Holland was able to just get in his car, and he knew where the steering wheel was, he knew where the gas pedal was, he knew how that car was laid out because somebody had gone to the trouble to make that a standardized format. So when we talk about open data, we're really talking about those standardized formats. Yeah? CSV is a very, very old, like older than me, standardized format. It has a definition of how those fields are produced. There is a comma at certain locations at the end of a field. There are rules for interpreting for the way that file has to be interpreted. Everybody knows what it is. Now, the second thing about open data is that it's free for everybody. There is no license restriction. Right? Imagine if this guy from Europe had tried to go to Hertz and go and get that car, and somebody said, "No, you come from Holland, you can't have that car. Sorry, that's just our rules." Yeah. The whole thing about the Hertz model and the reason Hertz is successful is because he was able to get in that car, show his license, and it just boom, done. It didn't matter who he was allowed to drive that car. Yeah? So open data then doesn't have any license restrictions on it. I'm not blocking you from being able to reuse that data, and that is key. Yeah? There are no copyrights on that data. I'm not restricting you. I'm not putting any kind of like barriers on, I'm putting minimal barriers on you for using that data. That's really, again, important. Sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, you download software sometimes and you skim through that EULA agreement. Goodness knows what it says, but you've got 5-6 pages full of stuff. And you get to the I accept at the bottom and you go, I hope that I'm not going to sign my life away, but okay, here goes, click. The whole thing about open data and files and open data when I make that data available to you is there are minimal restrictions. I want to say for City Open Data, 5 lines of licensing information, and that's basically saying you're not going to use this for bad stuff and the city won't be liable for the bad stuff. That's pretty well it. There is no copyright on what we do. It is really as open license, as open to everybody to reuse as possible. So when we talk about open data, we're talking about data that's in standard formats that can be easily understood, and we're talking about data that has minimal or no licensing restrictions on it. Because the whole point of open data is we want you to reuse that data. Yeah, we want you to tell you, not just tell your friends, but we also want you to go and talk about the way that to use the data in your apps. I want you to use the data in the way that would make sense for you as a community, you as an individual, but then share it with other people. Right? If you think about some of the great things that have been done through open data over the years, simple one is Where's My Bus, and Tom already mentioned that. The great thing about that is that it is there for the community use. UNM stood this up on our open data, and it is available for everybody, resident, commuter, person trying to get to work, to college, whatever it is. Use that site. Everybody benefits. Yeah. So they have taken our open data and they have reused it, represented it, and passed it on, and that is exactly what we want. So again, I tend to get very kind of like tight on what a definition of open data is. And for me, being able to do open data is one of those foundation hallmarks, if you will, of transparency. So spend a bit of time kind of like talking more about open data. I want to give you a kind of like insight into some of the challenges that goes on, because kind of like in my role in the city, it's really interesting hearing kind of like what people, how people see things like security. And sometimes it feels really like you're in the center of the storm, or you're kind of like being asked to make water flow uphill, whatever your particular metaphor is. Because sometimes the debate gets pretty heated. We should be we should be open in terms of making data available. Yes, we should, right up until it's my data, and then all of a sudden I've got a problem with that. We had one vendor a few years ago who's hard over on making everybody's contracts available, with one exception. Can you guess what that one exception was? Their own contracting information. They didn't not want to see that because they'd negotiated such a special price. In the end, we just turned around and said, right, we're either doing it all or doing none. And the answer is we do it all. We do make our contracts available in CSV format on the city website. So when we start thinking about some of these things, and this is kind of like one of the things I really enjoy about my position, sometimes there's some really gray areas we have to make some calls about. When we think about things like risk changes over time. And I look back at, say, 2013, it's like some of the decisions that I'd made about open data, I completely changed those now because there's a higher risk. We're all on Facebook, we're all on Apple, we're all on all these devices. Well, we heard a couple of weeks ago, obviously, there was a large cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, right? That's actually a pretty major deal. Facebook, we know, has had data leakages for goodness knows how long, yeah? And what happens is people will take all the information they know about Mark Leach from this data hack over here and all the information they know from this data hack over here. They'll put it together with this piece of open data over here that's freely available and should be. And then they'll put it all together and all of a sudden they know a lot about that person called Mark Leach. They'll know what I like, what my dislikes are, where I've driven my vehicle, what I've spent my money on. We had a good discussion about that at lunchtime. And there's good reasons that we want to do that. But then we're making assumptions about that privacy. And those assumptions tend to change over time. So that kind of like I say, what we did back in 2013 might no longer be secure or appropriate now for the world that we're in 2021. It's a great discussion. I'm not going to kind of like dwell on it too much because it really is a big topic. But if anybody wants to hit me up afterwards, happy to talk about it. It's one of those things that I really enjoy talking about. I want to talk a little bit about organization. And I think everybody goes, oh, the city of Albuquerque, or oh, City Hall, right? As if it's kind of like one building. You know, you can imagine it's kind of like, you know, four, almost like a shoebox kind of thing. City Hall emblazoned on the front, lights light up. You go in there and kind of like, you know, it's one unique point of entry. The thing is, that's not what happens. Yeah. So that has a number of implications. Really, so I heard it described best a few years ago. Really, City of Albuquerque is 26 departments or 26 different rival companies that coincidentally have the same logo. That's about as close as you get to kind of like the way City Hall works as one unified whole. And what that means is that the way the police department works is different to the way that fire works, is different again to the way that planning works, is different again to the way that Parks and Recreation works, is different to the way we put streets in, is different to the way that we fly airplanes in. And what that means from a technology perspective is we don't have one system across the back end. We'd love that, yeah? But that's not the way, that's not the reality in which we are. We're dealing with 26, at minimum 26 different different businesses, each with their own specialist software. These are a lot of the time, they're actually best of breed. They'll have come in from the private sector. Within the private sector, there's not the same requirements in terms of open data that we have within government. So at that point, I have some interesting decisions to make. Do I say, I'm not going to use the best software because it's not open? Or do I say, I'm going to have to figure out a different way of meeting my transparency obligations, but I'm going to be the best I can with the software? And those are interesting discussions. We have back and forth. Different arguments win at different points because obviously we need to make sure that we're being good stewards of taxpayer money. But these are really kind of like deep questions that we think about. So it's kind of like saying, oh, it's oh so easy. All you have to do is just go through City Hall and use one system. That's not the way in reality it works behind the scenes. Yeah, and that's kind of like a misperception that we see a lot when we talk about open data. So I want to talk a little bit more about how the sausage is made behind the scenes. And really what we've got is, like I say, we have all these different departments. We are now switching to think about what would it mean for us to put into our contracts. By definition, the city owns their own data. And when we get there, what can we do with that? So that's kind of like something that we're doing. But I want to just kind of like go through the process that we go through, which might answer why we don't immediately churn out city data, right? So say somebody gives me a data set. We were talking about trees at lunch, but we could also be talking about the public art data. The public art data we spent a long time going through with Sherry, Madrone, Karen and her team and their teams, and we went and also Nathaniel, and we went and did a really deep dive into what does that data mean, right? There are I want to say 6 different dates in that system, Nathaniel, 6, 7, yeah. And I learned this morning about accession date versus date, historical date, which I never knew. Yeah, so I learned something by this hackathon. But what does that mean? What is an accession date? How does that relate to a historical date? What do I need to use for the piece of software or piece of code I was writing? And when you talk about kind of like understanding like that, you have to do a really, really deep dive. I want to say we were working with the DTI team on that one for 3 or 4 weeks, at least, if close to a month, something around that kind of region, trying to really understand. And that was, TMS is quite a simple system behind the scenes. That's where the museum data gets stored. When it comes to things like budgets, or when it gets to things like HR systems, or computer-aided dispatch systems for the police, you have got hundreds of fields, each with a nuance. Each that the vendor has got their special kind of like accumulated knowledge about what that field does, which may have changed over time as we put upgrades in and add different functionality. There might be these subtle changes of nuance about really what does that field now mean. So when we do these deep dives, it's not a trivial thing. We have to get kind of like really deep dive into what does that data really, really mean. And then once we've got that data, we'll start producing file extracts, and there's different ways of doing that. Somebody can certainly talk to me later about APIs. I know that's a topic that comes up. But just getting the data out, once we've got the data feeds put together and we start looking at the data, we work with the business units to go and kind of like see what have we done wrong, how have we screwed up? Because seldom does it go right first time. Yeah. I saw this morning, for example, there's a bunch of data that I thought would have been populated. I've got to have a word with my team because the fields are empty. It's like, oh, that's not right. And I'm going, did we really do a QA on this one? Did we really test this? And that presupposes, of course, that the data was there and it was kind of like somebody the data was correct from the get-go, right? Which means that somebody had spent time to put it in. Well, sometimes it's the intern who does it. Sometimes it's a contractor who does it. Sometimes it's a person who's just about to retire. Sometimes it's somebody like me who's not been long doing a particular job. I don't know everything I'm meant to know. I make mistakes. I'm human. So going through and doing this whole QA process really helps us kind of like make sure that what we're producing is best quality overall. So. And like I say, even now, I'm still seeing stuff that, well, we did a QA process, but, oh, man, I'm sure there shouldn't be nulls in that field there. Or really, was that the best that we could do when we were putting measurements and dimensions in there? So we'll go back and we'll do back and forth. And kind of like, again, data is not this fixed point. It's always changing. It's slightly different, like with the security I was talking about. The data kind of like about 3 or 4 years ago would have been kind of like, yeah, would have been happy with that. Now we're looking at it and we're going, you know what, that's really got to be, we've got to be improving what we're doing here. So we're always in that constant state of improvement. And then finally, we'll take a look at it from a security angle. Yes, for each open data set we do actually do a security assessment now. And the reason for that is when I put data set A with data set B with data set C, all of a sudden I'm getting a really, really detailed picture of individuals. We're very conscious of the individual's right to privacy. We are very conscious of what are we doing to people if we go and release this data. So we take our obligations for this very, very seriously. Great example is when we put crime data out there. In somewhere like urban Albuquerque, putting the crime data out there and anonymizing to the block level, you won't know to whom that particular thing happened. It could be in a block of flats, well, a block of apartments, right? You know, good luck on trying to figure out who the victim was in that one. On the other hand, as you know, Albuquerque's got a pretty steep rural drop-off where we turn into a rural area, where people have kind of like, you know, property that's like acres and one house right in the middle. Well, that level of anonymization at that point, you know pretty well on that block, that person there, you know who that person was. So boom, all of a sudden your victim's rights have gone straight out the window at that point. Yeah, so we are very conscious of our obligations on that. We take them seriously. We do revisit. We're continually looking for best practices. And finally, we're also looking for the best ways to present the data. I'll be talking to people in the open data or in the civic tech community. We talk a lot about what data formats do we use. Do we need JSON? Do we need CSV? Sometimes we do use PDF. It's got some restrictions on it, but sometimes it's the appropriate format to use. Basically, we will use whatever other people can consume. So I want to also think about what data formats are appropriate. We will use data formats that have, obviously, like we said with open data, minimal licensing restrictions. So we will use JSON. We will also have APIs. We're starting to move into that arena much more. But again, this takes time. This takes a little bit of thought. So it's not kind of like stuff that we can suddenly turn on and say, yeah, we're going to go over here. Strategically, it's where we want to go. But we have to kind of like, we made a choice between getting stuff out, making open data available, and then coming right eventually and kind of like, you know, we'll do more advanced formats as we see the need grow. And then finally, I just want to touch on the way that we do work with vendors. Like I said, I know Tom was talking a little bit about some concerns that he's right to have around the way that vendors work. The good news is certainly when we talk to our vendors, we are trying to minimize the amount of data that actually gets locked behind intellectual property rights. Like I said, we're trying to make sure that that data is available to the city and the city owns it. We're not always successful in that because, to be quite frank, there are market leaders and they've made their money on kind of like holding people's data. And then the question becomes, do I make that risk assessment and say, you know what, the benefit of using that piece of software outweighs the restrictions on that? And it's an open question. You know, there's not always right answers for a lot of these. Okay, I've done quite a bit of talking. I think we can probably go into more of a question and answer. I've probably bored the heck out of everybody here, but certainly for questions for myself, for Tom, and for Melanie, let's see what everybody thinks out here.
Do we have any questions? Yes.
Silence. Okay.
It's sort of like the roulette wheel of,
Yep.
of
Who's going to go
microphones.
first? One of the questions I've got is what data sets do people want to see? I know we had a good discussion at lunchtime about, there was some discussion about trees. We're going to see if we can do some work around the trees. Pets was another one. What else? What other data sets do we think? Yep.
We mentioned health.
Health.
Health was out
absolutely,
there.
yeah.
I think, let's see, we talked a little bit about environment, I think. I'm not sure if you were, yeah.
Yep. Environment, yeah, I remember that coming up. Yep. What would you like to see within the environmental stuff?
Oh, I suggested corporate development.
Yeah. What would you like to see in particular?
Oh, it would just be interesting to see what kind of information you can get with that kind of data. I feel like there's a lot of anomalies you could find with that.
So certainly right now in open data, we make the red and green chili inspection results. They're actually available in something called LIVS format. LIVS is an open data format that got promoted by Yelp and City and King County, I want to say it was, a few years ago. So we certainly provide that out there right now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Eric. I would say that it's kind of an interesting question that to me has to do with more so like exposing what data there is, because you're saying some of that is already available. And when I went to the open data website for Albuquerque, I really didn't know what I'd be doing for the hackathon until I got to looking at what there was and kind of worked backwards through there. So I think for most of the general public, unless they're doing something specifically for a job, or they're just really concentrated on a particular thing for like a hobby, then it's nice to just kind of know what there is, and it kind of drives the innovation and curiosity to what could be done with that data.
And that's a really good point. A lot of it is kind of like when I talk about machine readable formats and all that kind of thing, you can just see kind of like, people go, Mark's going off about boring tech stuff again. But if I were to say, hey, you know that we can tell you where the next bus is and how long you're going to have to wait for that bus, then all of a sudden it becomes relevant. So one of the things I like is seeing what people can do with the data that we can kind of like highlight. We can say, hey, there was a scavenger hunt being done, or a kind of like the equivalent of finding out where public art is near me. How do I make a tour around public art? Seeing the actual uses to which we can put the public art. That's when it really starts to get that relevance to people. So we're kind of you're raising a good point. We need to be more open and more promote more what we do with that open data, but we also need to see kind of like what can people do with it that we can actually use as use cases. There's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg situation there.
Well, and I'll say part of the conversation at lunch also was about what we might look at next year or next time with an event like this. And I think one of the challenges, sort of the Venn diagram of what data is available. Also kind of what's the public interest? What's the public going to get interested in?
Right.
And sometimes are there organizations that can help, that can have an interest in this, that can help carry it forward? Because to Mark's point earlier, if you don't have endless money to make everything as available as possible. So choosing your battles as far as which pieces to prioritize and making more available, a lot of that gets driven by that public interest. So,
Absolutely.
that really
Absolutely
helps,
it
like,
does.
oh,
Yeah.
well, this was interesting. We saw how the value of this. I think in some topics, like potentially like, I don't know if it's public health, but environmental data, it's almost like we don't know what we're going to find. But if you have people who have that interest and you have organizations that are interested in that, they'll at least do the exploring versus put the information out there. And
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's really, I really enjoy this job, right? Because it's working with the community and it's having those kind of conversations. Alrighty. It is, hang on a moment, 3:05.
boy, you guys are excellent. You look like you're about to leave. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, let's see. Yeah, so I think one of the next steps, we haven't done a great job of capturing projects, but there is a little bit of a judging to do. So one of the things I was thinking would be kind of our next step is somehow maybe in the Google group or elsewhere capturing what projects folks are working on. That way there is a little bit of judging that, might even start, in the next 15 minutes.
I think that's pretty well our next stop right now.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if you have a chance before you leave just to kind of write down a little bit, links or something like that. But I think that's probably the
That's
next.
probably, we'll give people about 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll do a speak through from the judge's perspective.
So, and I don't know why, I just love this mic, it's so good. I'll put it through a couple of different email channels that we've got to get that out there and just say, if you've got something, please add it here. That way we can take a look.
Perfect. All right, I just before we leave, I want to just say a big thank you to certainly Melanie from FOG. Tom also, like I say, it's great working with you on these projects. And just appreciate doing this presentation with you guys.
I'm trying to impersonate a human being. I sometimes manage. Let's see.
The recording has stopped.
started with pretty